This week on Jerusalem Dateline, Iran sanctions U.S. officials from President Trump's administration. Could it be a death threat? And Iranian-backed forces attack U.S. troops in Iraq, demanding they leave. Plus, an exclusive report from Syria on the growth of democracy in the heart of the Middle East. And the biblical Shemitah year. What does it mean? All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Iran imposed sanctions on dozens of members of former President Donald Trump's administration. Some consider that those sanctions amount to assassination threats. And in fact, just one day after the sanctions were issued, a leader in Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps made just such a threat. One current U.S. official warned Iran of severe consequences for any harm done to them. Over the weekend, the commander of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Quds Force called for people to take action within the United States. He said, wherever it is needed, we will provide for the basis of revenge against the Americans from within their houses and by people by their side without us being present. In reply, White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan declared, "Make no mistake, the United States of America will protect and defend its citizens. This includes those serving the United States now and those who formerly served." Victoria Coates is one of the 51 on the sanctions list who served as Deputy National Security Advisor in the Trump administration. She warns Iran has attempted attacks on U.S. soil before.
They have expressed the intent to do violence against people in the United States. You go back to the 2011 plot against the then Saudi ambassador to the United States. Obviously, they are willing to do that.
So far, Iran has not been successful on U.S. soil, but Coates says they only have to be successful once. She says it serves as a wake-up call to the Biden administration.
I would like them to see the Iranian regime for what it is. This is what they do. And so when you are attempting to negotiate with them, bear this in mind. The smiling face you see across the table from you is maybe not the real face of this regime. And look at their actions, not at their words or what they might be willing to say in Vienna.
Coates warns about being too eager to enter into a nuclear agreement. In the meantime, talks resumed in Vienna to restart the Iranian nuclear negotiations. Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said Israel was not bound by the outcome of the talks.
Israel will continue to maintain full freedom of action anywhere and at any time without restrictions.
Former Israeli ambassador to the U.S. Congress, Yoram Ettinger, warns the U.S. administration is misjudging the Ayatollahs.
They seem to believe that the Iranian leopard can be induced to change its spots. The current administration in Washington assumes that terrorism in general is driven by despair, not by fanatic religious vision, but sadly divorced from reality.
Meanwhile, Iranian-backed forces launched 2 drone strikes against U.S. troops in Iraq. The Islamic regime wants all U.S. forces to leave the region, and they're threatening to keep up the attacks until they get what they want. Chuck Holton brings us the details.
On December 9th, 2021, the U.S.-led combat mission in Iraq came to an official end after 6,850 days. That momentous occasion, however, did not equal a ticket home for the 2,500 U.S. troops still stationed in the country. Neither did it signal a change of mission for 900 troops currently serving in Syria.
I expect that we will continue to provide some limited support to the Iraqis going forward. But again, it's going to be essentially, by and large, it's going to be a non-combatant process.
Remaining forces will pivot to a slightly different role, one they call advise and assist. They'll be providing support to Iraqi forces in the effort to stamp out the enduring vestiges of ISIS, which was officially defeated in 2017, but is lightly making a comeback. One neighbor clearly wants the U.S. out of the region.
Still pursues a vision of ejecting us from the theater, and they see the principal battleground for that as being in Iraq. And I believe they are under the view that they can increase friction in Iraq to where we will leave, and that will not affect the nuclear negotiations that are underway. That's not a military issue. That's an issue for U.S. national leadership. But I think it's a dangerous position for the Iranians to maintain, because I think they're not going to be able to decouple those two things.
Iran's president recently called for former President Trump and his top advisors to be charged with the 2020 killing of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani.
The then President of America, which is the main aggressor, murderer, and a criminal, must be prosecuted and killed. A sentence of God must be executed against him.
During this massive memorial held in Tehran on the anniversary of Soleimani's death, American and Israeli flags were burned and the familiar chant of "Death to America" echoed through the streets. Adding to regional instability, popular mobilization forces backed by Iran had been threatening violence if the U.S. did not pull out by the end of 2021. Now they're making good on those threats. Since the beginning of the year, missiles have been fired at U.S. bases in the region on an almost daily basis. So far, no injuries have been reported, as the killer drones were brought down by counter-rocket artillery and mortar batteries, which can fire more than 4,000 rounds per minute. The U.S. is now striking back in retaliation, which shows the combat phase of this conflict might not be over after all. For CBN News, I'm Chuck Holton.
Coming up, a Frontlines report on the growth of democracy in the heart of the Middle East. After the fall of ISIS, a large part of Syria began to form a government based on democracy, women's rights, and religious freedom. It's called the Democratic Autonomous Administration. I talked with Nadine Mayenza, the chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, while she was visiting the region, about this remarkable land in the heart of the Middle East. You're there in northeast Syria. Tell us about this story that's going on there that many people in the U.S. May not know or understand why it's so important.
So 5 years ago, the ISIS caliphate ruled this part of Syria. And, the Syrian Democratic Forces partnered with the U.S. government, and they liberated these areas from ISIS. And as they liberated areas from ISIS, what people don't know is that they were also setting up the people of this region self-governance called the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria that has produced now this government that gives everyone a seat at the table, regardless of ethnicity, religion, or gender. So you have 50% of the leaders women. You have Christians, Yazidis, Turkmen, Circassians, all sorts of ethnicities and religions participating. And it's produced what USERF has called out as being these remarkable religious freedom conditions and gender equality that is just unseen anywhere else in the Middle East.
Yeah, so this is a unique situation, something we don't see in the region.
Here, we have churches of converts from Islam to Christianity, and it's just not seen anywhere else. So it's really exciting to see freedom of religion or belief lived out. And of course, people that don't want to believe at all, because as we know, you have to have both, right? You have to be able to believe or not to believe. Mm-hmm. And this is a place where you can do either, and they all work together and are really working hard towards a more pluralistic community.
But this area is also under threat. You put a tweet on the other day about a Turkish attack. Can you describe what threats they're facing right now, particularly from Turkey?
So Turkey has decided all these people are terrorists, and has invaded 3 times now and has taken quite a bit of land up north, including a friend, Tel Abyad, Sarakani. And in these areas that Turkey has invaded and governs, USERF is called out because the conditions are very similar to how they were under the ISIS caliphate. We're seeing rapes, murders, killings, kidnappings, extortion, destruction of religious sites, particularly against Christians, Yazidis, and Kurds and women in those communities. So there's these horrific atrocities against religious minorities happening that used to have religious freedom. And so Turkey continues to shell. And when the day I got here, it was such a disappointment to find out that Turkey had actually used a drone to target civilians, killing one, injuring 11, including a 4-year-old boy who lost his leg. So these are the kind of things the people of Northeast Syria are putting up with from Turkey and the international community, the U.S. government, and needs to push them back to stop.
Yeah, what exactly would you like to see the U.S. government and the international community do in response to these attacks?
Well, clearly, I think the U.S. has a whole lot of levers they can use with Turkey economically, diplomatically, to push them back. And I think they have, because I know that Turkey wanted to invade again. In fact, they said they were going to invade again, and they haven't. So I know the U.S. government doesn't want to see that happen. I do hope that as we're speaking, that there is some diplomatic action happening or some threats of economic sanctions to push Turkey, who's a NATO ally, should not be acting this way against civilians.
Would you like to see the U.S. Recognize the administration there?
Absolutely. In fact, at the U.S. Commission, we've made some really powerful recommendations, and we're very single focused on religious freedom. We don't pick winners and losers because we like them. You know, I supported the Thomas administration before I even visited. So, and obviously since I've come here and gotten to know them, I like them even more and am more impressed by their commitment to tolerance and you know, building interfaith relationships. But our recommendations are to give recognition to the autonomous administration as a local legitimate government.
And how can people pray for what's going on there?
Well, people can pray that first of all, that the Christians and religious minorities here would have the strength to endure, you know, the continued struggles and persecutions they have. Pray for leadership here to be able to have wisdom, and for the U.S. government to be able to make the kind of hard choices. You know, earlier this week, they also had an interfaith conference here where they brought together all the interfaith leaders. And it was just the most amazing thing to talk about, have all these imams get up and talk about, you know, religious tolerance and about how Christians and Yazidis should be able to live together. And that is, you know, what they want here. So just pray that that continues, because that's the best way to fight the ideology that ISIS is pushing here. And the economy, though, is you know, it's a threat because, as we know, no matter how much you support a government, if you can't feed your family, it puts a lot of pressure on communities. So pray that this lightens the load so that the religious minorities that, you know, have been here since the beginning of Christianity are able to stay.
Up next, condolences from around the world for Israel's President Isaac Herzog on the passing of his mother, and a look at the historical impact of the Herzog family on the State of Israel. U.S. President Joe Biden and leaders from around the world sent their condolences to Israeli President Isaac Herzog on the passing of his mother. Ora Herzog, who was 97, was laid to rest in the Great Leaders of the Nation section at the Mount Herzl Cemetery. Ora was the wife of Chaim Herzog, Israel's 6th president. She was remembered by her son as having 3 great loves in her life.
First of all, your love of our father and the family. You were his source of strength and his partner on his extraordinary life's journey. Your second love was for the state of Israel, for the sake of whose resurrection you made Aliyah from Egypt, for whose sake you were seriously wounded in 1948, for whose success and prosperity you worked your whole life in many diverse realms. Your third love was for good taste, aesthetics, warm and high-quality hospitality, for cordially welcoming guests, and for understanding the big, wide world.
Here's a story CBN senior editor John Wagi did a few years ago about the incredible role Chaim Herzog played in Israel's history with his wife Ora at his side.
By the end of May 1967, the die was cast. Israel would soon be at war on all borders. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol tried to reassure the nation, but he was ill and faltered during his address. Military General Chaim Herzog stepped in to fill the gap with radio commentary in Hebrew and English.
A new page has been opened in the history of our people's battles and of the courage of Israel. And deep in the heart of each and every one of us at this moment, when we think of those engaged in the struggle, there is, irrespective of whether we normally pray or not, a prayer that the guardian of Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep.
During the Six-Day War, Chaim Herzog didn't just calm the nation. He became Israel's first military ruler over Judea and Samaria in more than 2,000 years. He was also a powerful presence as UN ambassador and later as president of Israel. Chaim Herzog died in 1997, but his legacy lives on. His son Isaac was only 7 when the war broke out. Still, he remembers the prevailing fear.
What we know is that there was a period of awaiting about 3 weeks before the war where the national mood was Auschwitz. Israel is going to its second Holocaust. Whoever leaves last should turn off the light and leave the country. That was the mood.
Isaac's older brother, Michael, now a retired major general, was 15 at the time. He says there's no doubt Israelis were concerned about the nation's survival.
So I still remember ourselves, like many other people in Israel, digging trench in our backyard because we expected that we'll be shelled, and we were shelled. Tel Aviv was shelled by the Jordanians during the Six-Day War.
The young people who have abandoned the cafes of Dizengoff Street and the discotheque, the farm boys, the yeshiva students, the members of the youth movements, the boys of the immigrant townships, all are at this moment shoulder to shoulder fighting in the air, on the land, and on the sea for our right simply to live.
You know what's interesting is we hear a lot today about the term fake news and that kind of thing. 67 was a banner year for fake news, especially in Egypt and in Syria, and your father was kind of counteracting that to a people that didn't know really what was happening. They had to hear the truth.
We would hear what was called Kol Kahir, Voice of Cairo, and they would speak in Hebrew, and they would say the worst things. We're going to throw you to the sea. I guess you heard it.
They said terrible things, and there was anxiety, but he provided very professional analysis. He first of all, he knew the situation.
I am broadcasting from Jerusalem to the sound of heavy shelling. A strange form of quiet and anticipation has fallen along the front line, a quiet that may foretell great tidings.
He would broadcast 3 times a day. He would also broadcast in English, so there were both BBC and others, but the 3 times a day you would walk in the streets of Tel Aviv and you would hear his voice throughout the city, people just listening, stopping and listening. And it was awesome. I heard his voice in the trench. I heard my dad, my mom brought a little radio, and we would hear him in the trench, and he calmed us down.
I was told by soldiers in the front lines, and they would listen to him, and I was told by quite a few of them that this really boosted their morale before going into battle.
Just 1 day into the war, Israel's Air Force virtually destroyed the capacity of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan to strike from the air. On the ground, Israel's army penetrated deep into the Sinai and pushed toward Jordan on the West Bank. By day 3, Chaim Herzog could tell the nation the unthinkable. After 2 millennia, Jerusalem was back in Jewish hands.
The miracle of our generation continues, as does the brilliant campaign, the like of which there is no record of in the history of Israel, and perhaps in the history of the nations, and which has achieved today what millions of Jews throughout the generations have prayed for.
We live in a very different era than 1967, but in my mind, what our father, the impact his broadcast had on the national morale is reminiscent of the impact that Churchill's broadcast had on British morale during World War II, and that was very significant.
And indeed the saying goes, Jerusalem is a gift of the whole land of Israel. On the altar of the Temple Mount and Mount Moriah, the people of Israel offered up today priceless sacrifices which swell the toll of sacrifice by earlier generations. Our victory was not lightly achieved, and at this moment it is well that we remember those who offered up their lives for the glory of the Almighty and the nation.
John Wagi, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Up next, a biblical look at the concept of Shemitah, letting the land itself have a Sabbath rest. Book of Leviticus in the Bible, God commands the Jewish people after they enter the Promised Land to give the land a rest or Sabbath every 7th year. Israelis Jeremy Gimpel and Ari Abramowitz of Irogoat Farms in the Judean Hills explain the importance of the commandment and its observance even today.
Just as humans have a 7-day cycle in our weeks, so the land of Israel itself has a 7-year cycle. And on the 7th day, just as we rest, like it says in the 10 Commandments, to rest and make that day holy, so every 7 years we take the 7th year and the land rests, and the fruit become holy. So we're not meant to work the land during that year. We're meant to let her rest. And what that really does for the Jewish people and what it's meant to teach the world is most people sort of see the earth and, well, how can we extract whatever we need as some sort of tool in our shed of what we need to accomplish? And Shemitah teaches us that the land is alive. We have a relationship with her. It's not something that we can just use and abuse, but just like we have Shabbat, the land has Shabbat. When the Jewish people are outside of the land becomes sad, goes into exile. When the Jewish people come back, she comes back to life again. She becomes happy again. And it's teaching us to not only connect to God, but to connect to nature itself, to connect to the land itself, and through that connect to God. And so this year is a sabbatical year, so there's no farmers working in the land. We're just letting the land rest and giving it back to God.
So the Torah tells us that one of the reasons for the exile that we endured for thousands of years was because we as a nation did not respect the sabbatical year, the Shemitah year. So God said, I will exile from your land so the land can have the sabbaticals that it's owed, that it deserves. And so now we're back in the land and we want to learn that lesson. We have a lot of lessons to learn from the exile that we endured, but one of them is to respect and honor the land as a gift that God has entrusted us with, but it doesn't belong to us. We belong to the land. The whole land belongs to God, especially on the sabbatical year, and it's a reminder of the truth of this world.
Well, that's one of the special biblical observances here in Israel today. Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And you can also access CBN content through our CBN News and other CBN apps. And don't forget to sign up for our email blast so you can continue to receive all of our exciting CBN content. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.